You may remember when we were looking at music in the Baroque period that we listened to The Four Seasons by Vivaldi, and I said that that was a piece that was way ahead of its time because it was trying to depict something very particular in instrumental music. Now that time has caught up. In the Romantic period, we have a lot of composers who write instrumental music specifically trying to tell us something. So up until this point, we've had music that's mostly music for the sake of it. We call that absolute music. This music now we call program music because there's some sort of program that goes with it or a story or something. So composers really intended for you to hear something. Now, as I've said earlier, you can listen to music all you want and you can paint any kind of musical pictures you want in your head, even if the composer never had any intention of creating that particular image in your head. I could put 10 people in a room, I can play you all a piece of instrumental music, and you might all come up with very different mental pictures to go with it. And that's going to be true even with this program music. The big difference here is that the composer actually intended to make you think something. So how do they do that? There are 4 different kinds of program music that we talk about, and each of them has its own little idiosyncrasies, we'll say. So let's just quickly go through what those 4 types are, and then we'll have some separate segments that introduce you to each one in more detail and let you listen to an example. So let's start with the concert overture. We know that an overture in the past has been a piece that was played before something else. So you go to the opera, there's an overture before the performance starts. That's what we think of when we think of overture. A concert overture doesn't have that function. In a concert overture, it's a freestanding piece, so it's not intended to be leading up to anything else. It just is a piece for itself. Most of the time, the story that the composer wants us to get from a concert overture has something to do with literature. So Romeo and Juliet is a very good example of that. Concert overture telling us the story of Romeo and Juliet in instruments. No words, no text, there's nobody reading the story over the top of it. So the composer has to know the content of that story and make decisions about how am I going to represent that so people will know what I'm talking about. So if we take Romeo and Juliet as an example, we know we've got 2 major characters and the 2 leads. So the composer might make a specific melodic element that represents each one. So Juliet, she's a young girl. Maybe we make a lovely little melody that represents Juliet. Romeo is our hero. Maybe we make him a little more manly kind of melody, whatever that might be. We know there's sword fighting in there, so we could have clashing cymbals, sorts of things to represent sword fighting. We have the love scene at the balcony, so you would have some sort of lush romantic thing going on there. The composer makes a choice about that and assumes that his audience knows the story well enough to make those associations. So that's what happens in a concert overture. You go to a concert, you hear this piece. You don't see anything on the stage that has to do with the story. Second type of program music, incidental music. Incidental music is like background music for a play. This is before movies and all of those sorts of things, but people would put theatrical productions on. They might have an orchestra to play music to support that production. So in this case, this is not music that happens all the time. If it were playing all the time, we'd never hear the actors saying their lines. So a lot of this music is fits with the storyline. So if there's a scene in the story where there's a dance, it would be very appropriate to have incidental music for them to dance to. Or maybe there's somebody's dying and you need some deeply tragic sounds to really reinforce this death scene that were happening. So a composer might write music specifically to go with the play. The play would be on the stage, the orchestra would be in the pit, and their music would support the action. That's called incidental music. Third type is called program symphony. We've already looked at symphony. We know that that's usually a 4-movement piece. It has a very particular kind of structure within that sonata cycle. It's for an orchestra. So we know those things about the symphony as a genre. Program symphony basically follows that same format. It's for an orchestra and it's in multiple movements. But the number of movements might not be 4. Why would we do that? Here's the big reason. It depends on what story the composer is trying to tell. Maybe this is not a story that fits neatly into our sonata allegro slow movement minuet trio fast movement kind of format. So the composer is going to make decisions about not only how many movements there are, but how those movements will be structured. Maybe it's not appropriate for the last movement to be something fast and lively. Maybe the character is dead at the end of the story. That wouldn't be appropriate. So it's going to follow the same basic structure as a symphony, multiple movements, but they're not going to be in that very structured format that we've been seeing so far. Program symphony. The last one is called the tone poem or symphonic poem. This is a term that was applied by Franz Liszt, who wrote lots of them. And again, like the Concert Overture, it's a one-movement piece. So how is it different from a concert overture? To your ears, it's probably not. You won't be able to tell any difference by listening. The basic difference between the two is in what it's trying to depict. If you'll remember, I said that a concert overture often has something to do with some sort of literary reference. In a tone poem, the scope of things that you can describe is much wider. So we might still stick with a literary reference, but we might also do some sort of historical event that we want to depict. We might take a piece of epic poetry and try to describe that. There's a very famous one called Don Juan. So it's the story of Don Juan, the Casanova who's got women all over the place, and all of his adventures. So the breadth of things that we can cover is more. We might do things that have to do with our environment. What's our landscape like? Something about a majestic sight you might have seen. All of those things would be appropriate for use as a tone poem. So these are the four big categories. As you look for pieces of music that fit these categories, one of the things you can look for is titles, because the titles are generally going to tell you what the story is. Ein Heldenleben, which is a hero's story. That tells you right there's a story connected to this piece. Don Juan, Romeo and Juliet. If it says Symphony No. 6 in C minor, it's probably not program music, because that tells us nothing about what the piece is supposed to represent for us. So as we look at specific examples of this type of music, you'll be thinking about the story or the picture or whatever it is the composer is trying to create for us, and figure out how they took the elements of that, transfer them into sounds instead of words and pictures, and gave us a whole new type of artwork that is unique and new in the Romantic period.